Princess Vyra of the Zixithari Dominion had always been told that humans were fragile, a mistake of evolution. Their flesh tore too easily, their bones snapped under the lightest pressure, and their minds wavered under the weight of true war. She had seen the reports, heard the dismissive scoffs of her advisors. They were an anomaly in the galaxy, somehow surviving despite their frailty, despite lacking the hardened exoskeletons, redundant organs, and raw strength of more advanced species. And now, as she sat upon her throne, watching the human delegation stand before her, she saw no reason to doubt it. The Zixithari High Council had agreed to this meeting, though Vyra found it pointless. These humans were seeking diplomacy, offering trade and military cooperation as if they were equals. She barely stifled her skepticism. The Dominion did not need their aid. It had flourished for centuries, spanning 12 planets, its military unmatched across the sector. What could these creatures possibly offer that the Zixithari did not already possess? She examined the human ambassador as he spoke. His hands twitched lightly, sweat beaded at his temple. He was nervous. That was wise, at least. The throne room itself was designed to command respect. Obsidian walls, towering statues of Zixithari leaders, banners depicting centuries of conflict. 2 elite guards stood at Vyra's side, each 7 feet tall, their dark chitinous armor gleaming under the crimson glow of the chamber's torches. This was not a room for the faint. Behind the ambassador stood his contingent of human soldiers. They were barely worth noticing, clad in light armor, carrying unfamiliar weapons, their expressions carefully neutral. Yet Vyra could sense their unease. They did not belong here. Her gaze flickered toward one of them. He was different. The others stood rigid, careful, but he moved like a predator contained in a cage. His stance was relaxed, yet calculated. His dark eyes never stopped scanning the room, never settled on one point too long. Unlike his ambassador, he was not shifting or hesitating. His uniform read, CPL, Darius Quinn. Vyra barely had time to dwell on this when the world shook. A deafening roar tore through the chamber, followed by a shockwave that cracked the golden doors. Smoke and fire filled the air as the room trembled, sending fractures up the stone pillars. The human ambassador stumbled back, his words lost in the chaos. Figures emerged from the swirling haze. Zixithari dissidents, their armor jagged and blackened, weapons humming with unstable energy. Their leader, taller than most, stepped forward, his mandibles clicking in anger. "The Dominion will fall," he bellowed. His soldiers raised their weapons. Vyra did not move. Her heart pounded, but not with fear. She had faced threats before. She was Zixithari. She would not flee. But before her guards could react, a human hand seized her wrist. The sensation was so unexpected that for a second Vyra froze. She twisted her head sharply and found herself face to face with him. Anger. Corporal Darius Quinn. His grip was firm, calloused, warm. The softness of human skin should have felt unnatural, yet there was something unshakable about it. "Move," he commanded. Vyra's first instinct was to remove his hand immediately. No one touched a Zixithari royal unbidden. She hissed, baring her fangs. "Unhand me, soldier, before I—" A plasma shot shrieked through the air. Vyra barely had time to register the heat before Quinn pulled her down, the blast searing past her shoulder. The throne behind her melted into molten slag. She stiffened. That would have been fatal. Quinn didn't hesitate. He dragged her behind one of the massive stone pillars, his movements smooth and instinctual. He wasn't just reacting, he had done this before. Vyra twisted in his grip, frustration sparking in her eyes. "You overstepped." "With all due respect, Your Highness," he cut in, voice calm despite the chaos. "Focus on staying alive." Vyra was so stunned that she did. For the first time in her life, she followed a human's lead. Quinn peeked out from cover, assessing the battlefield in a heartbeat. The dissidents had spread out. engaging both human and Zuthwithari guards. His expression darkened. "They planned this," he muttered. "This wasn't a random attack." Vera's eyes narrowed. "How did they breach the palace?" "No idea, but we'll be in trouble if we stay here." He tapped his earpiece. "Quinn to command. We've got an attack on the royal chamber, confirming high-value target secure." Static. "Then, copy, Quinn. Do you need an extraction?" Quinn glanced at her. "That depends." Vira straightened, shoving his hand off her. "I will not retreat." Quinn gave her a dry look. "I didn't say retreat. I said survive." He reached for his sidearm, drawing a compact human firearm, one of their less advanced weapons. Except when he aimed, he didn't miss. 3 shots, 3 rebels collapsed, hit precisely in the gaps of their armor. Vira's eyes widened. That was unbelievable. Zikzithari sharpshooters trained for decades to make those shots. Humans weren't supposed to be capable of such precision. Quinn turned back, lips curling in a smirk. "You good, princess?" She glared at him. "I am not accustomed to relying on others." "Well, today's full of firsts." He pulled something from his belt and threw it. A small metal canister bounced across the floor. Then a blinding flash. The rebels recoiled, their sensitive eyes overwhelmed by the burst of light. "Move," Quinn barked. To Vira's own surprise, she obeyed. They sprinted through the chaos, ducking under falling debris, weaving past wounded guards and scattered bodies. Quinn moved like a shadow, quick and efficient, his weapon never lowering. A blast rocked the corridor, sending shrapnel flying. Vira hissed as something sharp nicked her cheek, but Quinn, the human, took the brunt of it. He shoved her down, taking the hit across his shoulder. His armor burned away, blood seeping from the wound. Vira turned, stunned. Humans bled so easily. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice quieter than before. Quinn exhaled sharply, pain flickering across his features, but he smirked. "Better me than you." Vira stared. No Zitzithari she had ever known thought like that. This human was either reckless or something far more formidable. Vira's pulse thundered in her ears. The acrid scent of scorched metal and plasma fire lingered in the air, mingling with the distant echoes of combat. She had fought many battles, trained to face any threat without fear, but this, being pulled, protected by a human? Unacceptable. She tore her wrist from Quinn's grip. "Do not touch me again." The human barely reacted. His focus remained on their surroundings, his weapon raised, his posture unwavering. "Noted," he said, unbothered. Vira's pride bristled. He should have been intimidated. Any Zigzithari warrior would have thought twice before handling royalty with such disregard. Yet this human had dragged her through open fire without hesitation, dismissing her outrage as though it meant nothing. Before she could demand an explanation, Quinn moved. He pressed himself against the corridor wall, scanning ahead with measured precision. His breathing was controlled, his fingers steady despite the fresh burn seared across his shoulder. Vira studied him carefully. His movements differed from Zwithari warriors, less rigid, more instinctual. Where her people relied on brute force, he used efficiency. Every step, every glance held a purpose. She hated admitting it, but the human was disciplined. He gestured, "Move." Vira growled under her breath but followed. They slipped through a damaged archway into a side corridor lined with towering statues of past rulers. Their stone visages glared down, carved to immortalize Zwithari conquests. Vira knew these faces well. She had been raised on their victories, their unyielding strength. And now she was hiding beneath their gaze, escorted by an off-world soldier. Her claws flexed in frustration. This would not stand. As they moved, she observed Quinn from the corner of her eye. His posture never wavered, his gaze never settled. He was not afraid. "You fight well," she admitted, voice low. The words felt foreign in her mouth. Quinn snorted. "That sounded painful for you to say." Vira bared her fangs. Do not mistake observation for praise. Wouldn't dream of it, princess. He kept his eyes on the corridor ahead. She narrowed her gaze. He spoke without deference. No hesitation, no second guessing. He acted as though they were equals. She should have been offended. Instead, she found it unsettling. A distant explosion shook the palace. Quinn muttered something in his own language before tapping his earpiece. "Command, this is Quinn. We need a status update." Static. His expression darkened. "Comms are down." Vyra frowned. "Your forces are unresponsive?" "Looks like it." He sighed. "Probably jamming signals smart." "Ah." Vyra's mandibles clicked in frustration. The attack had been planned too well. This was not an opportunistic ambush. "We risk a direct assault," she muttered. "The Dominion is too strong to overthrow with a single strike." Quinn adjusted his grip on his weapon. "Maybe stopping you is enough." Vera turned sharply. "You assume I am their only target?" "I'm assuming you're their biggest obstacle." The words were simple, but something in his tone caught her off guard. She had spent her life surrounded by warriors and officials who spoke to her with either reverence or fear. But Quinn's voice carried neither, only certainty. Before she could respond, heavy footfalls echoed down the hall. Quinn exhaled through his nose. More company. Vera lifted her chin. Good. She reached for the ceremonial blade at her waist. The weapon hummed with latent energy. Xyzwathari tradition dictated that royalty never fled from battle, and she had no intention of starting now. Quinn caught her arm, again. Vyra whirled, eyes flashing with fury, but he held firm. "You charge in, we both die," he said, voice calm. Vyra's claws twitched. "I do not fear death." Quinn met her gaze. "Then fear wasting it." Vyra hesitated. It was brief, only a moment, but Quinn saw it. He took advantage, pulling her toward a nearby service panel. With a swift motion, he pried it open, revealing a network of tunnels beneath the palace walls. He gestured inside. In? Vyra stiffened. "You expect me to crawl through maintenance tunnels?" "Yes, immediately." Vyra's mandibles tightened, but before she could argue, the enemy's shadows stretched across the corridor. Quinn pushed her inside, slipping in after her as plasma fire tore through the air where they had stood. Vera landed hard against the metal flooring. The space was cramped, the walls pressing close. She bristled at the indignity. Behind her, Quinn let the panel slide shut. Darkness enveloped them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the distant echoes of battle and Quinn's steady breathing. Vera exhaled, adjusting to the sudden stillness. Then, quietly, she said, "I should kill you for that." Quinn, still catching his breath, let out a soft chuckle. "You can try." She turned, barely able to make out his silhouette in the dim tunnel. He wasn't looking at her. He was checking his weapon, posture relaxed despite the chaos above. Vyra's claws curled against the metal floor. He had manhandled her, defied her orders, questioned her decisions. And yet, for reasons she could not name, she did not strike him. Instead, she asked, "Why did you stop me?" Quinn paused. In the dim light, she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, as if debating his response. Finally, he met her gaze. "Because I've seen too many good soldiers die running into unwinnable fights." Vyra studied him, expecting arrogance, expecting bravado, but she found neither. Only experience. She turned away. The tunnels stretched ahead, leading them deeper beneath the palace. There was no telling where they would emerge or what awaited them when they did. For the first time in her life, she was forced to rely on a human. And to her frustration, she suspected he might be worth relying on. The tunnels beneath the palace were colder than Vyra expected. The air carried a damp, metallic tang, a mixture of stagnant water and old wiring. The Dominion rarely used these maintenance shafts. They were beneath warriors, beneath royalty. Yet here she was, crouched in the confined passage, her movements restricted, her every breath echoing against the walls. Her pride flared at the indignity of it. She was Zictheri. She did not hide from battle. Quinn, however, moved through the space with practiced ease. Despite the low ceiling and narrow walls, his form remained balanced, precise. His injured arm hung stiff at his side, blood soaking through the torn fabric of his uniform, but he did not slow. Vira glanced at the wound. The burn was ugly, the flesh beneath charred. It would take hours, if not days, for a human to heal from something so severe. Yet Quinn had not complained once. It was unnatural, not the injury itself, but his reaction to it. Any Zuthari warrior would have acknowledged the pain, reveled in it even, but Quinn had merely absorbed the damage and kept moving. No roar of defiance, no dramatic display of endurance, just quiet, calculated survival. Vira clenched her jaw. This was not how weakness behaved. She quickened her pace to match his. How much farther? Quinn tapped a small device on his wrist, and a faint holographic map projected onto the tunnel wall. Another 50 meters. There's a junction ahead. Should lead us to a maintenance exit. And if it doesn't, then we improvise. Vera scoffed. That is not a strategy. Quinn shot her a lopsided smirk over his shoulder. Worked so far. Vira had no response to that, which only irritated her more. Before she could push the argument, a distant clang echoed through the tunnel. Quinn stopped instantly, his entire body going still. Vera followed suit, her instincts sharpening. Footsteps. Heavy. Multiple. The rebels had found the tunnels. Quinn switched off his map, pressing himself against the cold metal wall. Vira mirrored him, her fingers curling around the hilt of her blade. The sound of boots striking metal grew louder, closing in fast. They were outnumbered, trapped. Vira exhaled, readying herself to strike, but before she could move, Quinn caught her wrist. Again. She barely restrained a snarl. He leaned in, voice barely a whisper. Fighting in this space is suicide. If you get pinned, you can't dodge. If you swing too wide, you'll hit the walls. Vera hated that he was right. She had spent her entire life training for combat, mastering every form of Zuthari warfare. But these tunnels were not a battlefield. They were a trap. Strength alone would not save her here. Then what do you suggest? She whispered. Quinn's gaze flickered to a grate above them. We go up. Before Vira could protest, he climbed. His fingers found holds in the metal panels, his boots bracing against the slick walls. Even with his wounded arm, he moved fast. By the time Vira registered his plan, he had already reached the vent. He pried it open with a grunt, then glanced down. You coming? Vera hissed in irritation but followed. Her claws made the climb easier, her agility allowing her to reach him in seconds. She pulled herself into the vent just as the rebels rounded the corner below. From their hiding place they watched. A group of 5 Zedzithari rebels stalked beneath them, weapons humming with residual heat. Their leader, a massive warrior clad in scorched armor, turned to the others. The princess is still alive. Find her. Vira's muscles tensed. Quinn placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent command to wait. She had never waited before, never hidden, but something in his expression, calm, deliberate, made her pause. Below, the rebels moved on, unaware. Only when their footsteps faded did Quinn exhale and shift his weight. All right, he murmured. Let's move. Vira followed him through the ventilation shaft, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. For the first time in her life, she had been forced to flee instead of fight. And worse, she had trusted a human's judgment over her own. She did not know which unsettled her more. The shaft led them to another access point, a narrow opening overlooking the palace outskirts. Outside, fires raged, smoke curling into the night sky. The rebels had struck hard. Quinn inspected the drop, about 20 feet. Vira raised her brow. That is nothing. Before he could react, she leapt. She landed smoothly, rolling with the impact before rising to her feet. She turned, expectant. Quinn stared at her. You're showing off. I am demonstrating efficiency, she corrected. He snorted. Right. Then, with far less grace, he jumped. He hit the ground with a heavy thud, wincing as his wounded arm absorbed some of the force. Vira smirked. Not so fragile, are you? Quinn exhaled, adjusting his stance. Not planning on dying today, if that's what you mean. She tilted her head, watching him. The more time she spent with this human, the more he confused her. He lacked the natural armor and enhanced physiology of her kind, yet he compensated with something else entirely: sheer resilience. He had no business surviving a battle like this, yet here he was, still standing, still fighting, still keeping pace with her. Maybe humans weren't weak. Maybe they were something else entirely. Quinn tapped his earpiece again, more static. He sighed. Looks like we're on our own. Vera straightened. Then we find a way back inside. The rebels cannot be allowed to control the palace. Quinn arched a brow. You planning on taking them all yourself? Vira flashed her fangs. Would you bet against me? A slow grin spread across his face. No, but I'm still coming with you. Vira did not argue. For the first time, she did not mind. The air in the tunnels was thick with dust and the scent of scorched stone. The deeper Vira and Quinn moved, the quieter the chaos outside became, replaced by the steady drip of moisture from unseen cracks in the ancient walls. The passage was narrow, forcing them to move single file, with Quinn keeping his weapon raised and Vira's blade humming softly at her side. The Dominion had many hidden routes beneath its grand structures, but she had never thought she would be forced to use them. Quinn moved efficiently despite his injury. His breathing remained controlled, his focus unshaken, though his left arm still hung stiff at his side. Vira had expected him to slow down, to struggle under the weight of his wound, but he didn't. It wasn't strength that kept him moving. It was sheer willpower. She had never seen anything quite like it. They reached a junction where the tunnel split into two paths. Vira scanned the markings carved into the walls, old symbols meant to guide the palace's engineers. The left passage leads to a concealed entrance near the throne room. Quinn glanced down the right tunnel, which sloped downward into darkness. And the other way? An old waterway that feeds into the underground reservoirs. He exhaled. Let's hope we don't end up needing an escape route. They moved left. The passage slanted upward, the air growing warmer as they approached the inner structure of the palace. The flickering emergency lights above cast long shadows across the walls, making it impossible to tell if they were alone. Vira kept her senses sharp, listening for movement, scanning for any sign of security triggers. Then she heard them, voices. She halted, signaling for Quinn to stop. The sounds were coming from just ahead, past a bend in the tunnel. He pressed against the opposite wall, mirroring her stance as they listened. Deme said she escaped, one voice muttered. A second answered, rough and low. Then she'll come here. The others are securing the throne room. If she tries to reach it, we intercept. Quinn met Vira's gaze, his expression unreadable. That answers that, he whispered. Vira's claws flexed against the hilt of her blade. The enemy was waiting. This wasn't just an attack. It was a calculated strike. The rebels weren't moving blindly. They had planned this. She whispered, How many? At least 4 in this passage. Could be more beyond the bend. Vira calculated their options. A direct charge would be reckless in such close quarters. If the rebels were prepared, they would be positioned to fire the moment she stepped forward. There had to be another way. Quinn studied the ceiling, then his gaze flicked downward toward the uneven flooring. I have an idea, he murmured. Vira narrowed her eyes. I do not like the way you said that. Quinn smirked slightly. Then you're really not going to like this. Before she could stop him, he stepped into the open. Vera barely contained a hiss of frustration as he made himself visible. He wasn't running, wasn't even trying to stay hidden. He walked slowly, his wounded arm limp at his side, exaggerating his movements as if he were struggling to stay upright. The voices ahead went silent. Then one of the rebels barked, "Human, stop!" Quinn raised his good hand in mock surrender. "Wow, you guys are good. I was hoping to make it a little farther before you caught me." Vera shifted in the shadows, her body coiled like a predator waiting to strike. One of the rebels stepped forward, weapon raised. "Where is she?" Quinn sighed dramatically. "You know, I'd love to tell you, but she kind of ditched me. Royals, right? Always leaving others to clean up their mess." The rebel sneered. "You lie." Quinn shrugged. "Maybe. But if she were here, wouldn't she have attacked by now?" That was all Vira needed. She moved before the rebels could react, a blur of motion slicing through the dim tunnel. The first enemy barely had time to turn before her blade found its mark. The second raised his weapon, but Quinn was already there, knocking it aside with a sharp strike to the ribs before following up with a clean shot. The last two tried to retreat. One nearly made it. Vira caught him by the arm and drove her knee into his side before finishing him with a swift, precise strike. The final rebel turned his weapon on Quinn, but the human was faster than expected. He dodged, grabbed the barrel, and fired a single shot into the soldier's chest. The passage fell silent again. Vira turned to Quinn, her breathing even despite the rush of combat. "You used yourself as bait." Quinn flexed his fingers before holstering his weapon. And it worked. Vira should have been furious. He had acted recklessly, put himself at unnecessary risk. But instead of anger, she felt something else entirely, something dangerously close to respect. She exhaled, sheathing her blade. "Next time, warn me." Quinn smirked. "Where's the fun in that?" She shook her head and strode forward. The throne room was close. The battle was far from over. But for the first time she found herself wondering if having a human at her side might not be a weakness after all. The air in the upper corridors of the palace was thick with the scent of smoke and blood. The battle still raged beyond the walls, distant echoes of gunfire punctuating the tense silence that had settled between Vira and Quinn as they moved through the ruins. The hidden passage had taken them dangerously close to the throne room, but the destruction around them made it clear the rebels had arrived first. Vira stepped over the body of a fallen guard, her claws flexing as she took in the damage. The once immaculate obsidian floors were littered with debris, the walls marred with scorch marks from plasma fire. Tapestries that had hung undisturbed for generations now lay in smoldering heaps. Her people prided themselves on their strength, their ability to defend what was theirs. Yet the palace, the heart of the Dominion, had been infiltrated with startling precision. She clenched her jaw. This was not a battle, it was a message. Quinn crouched beside the fallen guard, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck before exhaling sharply. "He's gone," he muttered, pushing himself upright. His expression was unreadable, but Vira had been around warriors long enough to recognize when someone was suppressing frustration. She studied him as he checked his weapon. His movements were sharp, deliberate. The wound on his shoulder still bled, but he never let it slow him. It was something she was beginning to understand about him. Humans fought past their limits, not because they were invincible, but because they refused to stop. "This wasn't an attack," Vira said finally. "It was an execution." Quinn glanced at her. "Yeah, I figured that out when I saw they weren't taking prisoners." Vira's eyes darkened. The Dominion was built on power, on the belief that those who could not hold their ground did not deserve to keep it. It was a harsh philosophy, but it had sustained her people for centuries. Yet what she saw now, guards cut down at their posts, servants slain in the halls. This was not power. This was something else entirely. "They knew exactly where to strike," Quinn continued, stepping over a fallen pillar. "They had a plan, they had intel, and they knew when to act. This wasn't just some rogue faction trying to make a statement." Vira's claws tightened. "Someone inside the palace helped them." Quinn nodded. "That'd be my guess." The realization settled between them, heavy and unspoken. If there was a traitor among her people, it meant the rebellion was far more organized than she had anticipated. It meant this wasn't just a fleeting act of defiance. It was the beginning of something larger. And that meant the throne room wasn't just their next objective. It was a trap. Vira exhaled, calculating. If they expect me to walk into an ambush, we need to shift the balance. Draw them out. Force them to react. Quinn's lips curled slightly. I like where this is going. She motioned toward a side corridor. The throne room has 3 entrances. The rebels will expect me to take the main path. You will go around. Force them to split their focus. Quinn frowned. You sure you want to split up? Vira's mandibles twitched in amusement. You hesitate now? He shook his head. Just making sure you're not about to get yourself killed. Vira smirked, gripping the hilt of her blade. They should be asking the same about themselves. She turned before he could respond, moving toward the primary entrance. The grand doors were already open, the elaborate carvings scorched from the battle. Beyond them, the throne room loomed in eerie silence. The great banners of the Dominion hung from the ceiling, torn but still standing, and in the center of the chamber, seated upon the throne as though he belonged there, was the rebel leader. He was tall, even by Zitheri standards, his armor bearing the jagged insignia of the rebellion. His mandibles curled in satisfaction as Vira entered, his claws resting lazily on the arms of the throne. Around him, his warriors stood at attention, their weapons trained on her. Vira did not stop. She walked forward with measured steps, her expression unreadable. You wear the seat of the Dominion as if you have earned it. The rebel chuckled, tilting his head. And you walk into your own demise as if you still hold power. Vira stopped a few paces away, her blade still at her side. You expect me to beg for mercy? The rebel leaned forward. No, princess, I expect you to kneel. A sharp sound cut through the tension, the crack of a single gunshot. The rebel staggered as a bullet tore through his shoulder, his body jerking from the impact. The room erupted into chaos. Quinn? Vira moved. Before the rebels could react, she was upon them. Her blade cut through the first soldier's armor, the energy humming as it sliced through with lethal precision. She twisted, driving her knee into another enemy's ribs before finishing him with a sharp strike. Quinn emerged from the shadows above, rifle trained, cutting down 2 more rebels before they could take cover. The rebel leader roared in pain, clutching his wounded shoulder as he lunged for his weapon. Vira was faster. She kicked him back, sending him sprawling onto the steps of the throne. For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. He had believed she would walk into his trap, that she would be another dethroned ruler brought low by a greater force. He had never considered that she was the storm he could not control. She pressed the tip of her blade against his throat. Kneel. The throne room fell silent. The remaining rebels hesitated, their weapons still raised but their confidence shaken. Their leader, the one who had declared victory before the battle had even ended, was at her feet. Quinn stepped forward, his rifle still aimed. You want to take prisoners, or are we doing things the hard way? Vira tilted her head. I do not need to take prisoners. The rebel leader bared his teeth. Then finish it. Vira stared down at him. She had been raised to believe that power belonged to those strong enough to take it, that mercy was a weakness. But as she stood there, blade poised, she realized something else. Strength was not just about destroying an enemy. It was about deciding when not to. She pulled her blade back. Your war ends today. The leader snarled, but his warriors did not move to defend him. Without the certainty of victory, their conviction wavered. One by one, they began to lower their weapons. Quinn exhaled, lowering his rifle. Well, that was dramatic. Vira turned to him. His uniform was stained with blood, his stance firm despite his exhaustion. A human soldier who had fought beside her, not as a tool, not as a liability, but as an ally. Maybe even something more. She sheathed her blade. I learned from the best. Quinn grinned. Now that's a strategy I can get behind. The battle was over, but as Vira looked at Quinn, at the chaos they had survived, she realized something had shifted. And it had nothing to do with the throne. The throne room stood in ruin. Smoke curled from shattered pillars, the scent of scorched metal and blood still thick in the air. Vira took in the destruction, the fallen banners, the bodies of warriors who had fought on both sides, the cracks in the once impenetrable obsidian walls. The Dominion had won today, but the weight of the battle still pressed heavy on her chest. At the base of the throne, the rebel leader knelt, wounded but still defiant. His warriors, those who remained, had surrendered. Some stared at Vira with hatred, others with resignation. They had expected execution. Vira studied them carefully. These were not cowards. They had fought with conviction, with belief. She had been raised to think of rebels as traitors, yet looking at them now she saw something else. They had not fought for greed or conquest. They had fought because they believed in change. Beside her, Quinn stood with his rifle lowered but not forgotten. His uniform was torn, smeared with dust and blood, his arm still stiff from the wound he had taken earlier, yet he had not faltered. He had fought alongside her, risked himself not because he was ordered to, but because he had chosen to. One of the captured rebels, a younger soldier with a cracked helmet, looked up at Vira and sneered. "Get it over with. That's how the Dominion works, isn't it? Those who oppose you don't get to walk away." Vira's claws flexed at her sides. She had spent her entire life believing that strength ruled above all else, that mercy was weakness, that allowing an enemy to live only invited future betrayal. But had fear truly kept the Dominion strong? If so, why had her own palace nearly fallen today? She met the young rebel's gaze. "You think I should kill you?" He did not look away. "Isn't that what your people do?" Quinn exhaled beside her, his voice quieter than usual. "They expect you to be exactly what they were fighting against." Vira considered his words. She had been raised to rule with power, with control. But power was not just about destruction. Power was deciding when not to destroy. She turned to the rebel leader, still kneeling, still breathing hard from the pain of his injury. "This attack was planned too well. You had help. Someone inside the palace gave you access." The leader scoffed but said nothing. Vira stepped closer, her tone sharp. "Tell me who." He lifted his chin, his mandibles clicking in defiance. "And if I refuse?" Quinn spoke before she could. "Then the next time someone tries this, they might actually win." Silence settled over the room. The rebel's expression flickered, just for a second, but Vira saw it. He knew Quinn was right. Finally, the leader exhaled. "There are others. More than you realize. People who believe the Dominion cannot last as it is. You may have won today, but this is not the end." Vira studied him. No fear, no regret, just belief. She had spent years thinking that loyalty came from dominance. But today Quinn had stood by her not because he was forced to, but because he had chosen to. What if her people could choose too? She straightened. "The Dominion does not waste warriors." The rebel leader frowned. "What are you saying?" "I am saying you lost," Vira said. "And you will live with that loss. But if you truly believe in something greater, then fight for it, without slaughtering your own people to do it." The leader's eyes narrowed. "You expect us to serve you?" "No," Vira said. "I expect you to decide for yourself whether the Dominion is worth fighting for." A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, the rebel leader lowered his head. Not in defeat, in understanding. Quinn let out a low whistle beside her. "Didn't see that coming." Vira glanced at him. "What did you expect?" He smirked. "Something bloody." She exhaled, turning away from the prisoners. The sounds of reinforcements grew closer, the battle outside settling into uneasy quiet. The Dominion had survived today, but things had changed. She had changed. Quinn slung his rifle over his shoulder, wincing slightly. So, what now? Vira looked at him, this human who had fought beside her, challenged her, changed how she saw the world. Now, we rebuild, she said. Quinn tilted his head. You planning on keeping me around for that? Vira smirked, stepping past him. You are still alive, aren't you? He chuckled, falling into step beside her. Guess I am. As they walked away from the battlefield, Vira realized something she had never considered before. The strongest rulers were not those who ruled alone. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't facing the future alone. The palace had been secured. The rebels who remained had been disarmed, their leaders taken into custody. The halls, once filled with the chaos of battle, were now eerily quiet, save for the murmurs of soldiers tending to the wounded and restoring order. The throne room, though still scarred from the fight, stood as a testament to resilience. The Dominion had endured. Vira stood at the edge of the grand balcony overlooking the city. Fires still smoldered in the distance, and the sky bore the marks of the conflict that had unfolded. Yet, as she watched her people moving below, warriors, engineers, diplomats, all working to rebuild, she realized something profound. The Dominion was not just its rulers or its military strength. It was its people. And for the first time, she wondered if ruling with strength alone would be enough. Behind her, Quinn approached, his movements quieter than usual. He had finally let a medic tend to his wound, though he still looked worse for wear. Blood stained his uniform, a stark contrast against the crisp banners that now fluttered once more over the palace walls. You look deep in thought, he said, stopping beside her. Vira didn't turn immediately. You fought well today. Quinn smirked. You sound surprised. She finally met his gaze. I am not. He raised an eyebrow at that. There was no sarcasm in her tone, no sharp remark meant to cut. Just acknowledgement, maybe even respect. The wind carried the distant sound of hammers striking metal as repair crews worked to restore the damage. The Dominion had won the battle, but what came next? There would be more uprisings, more challenges. The rebellion had been more than just a group of dissidents. It had been organized, funded, and someone inside the Dominion had helped them. Quinn leaned against the balcony railing. So, what happens to the rebels? Vira exhaled. They will be given a choice. Those who continue to fight will answer for their crimes. Those who are willing to change, willing to rebuild, will have the chance to do so. He studied her for a long moment. That's different? She tilted her head. Do you disapprove? No. Quinn shook his head. I think it's exactly what your people need. Vira had expected him to argue, to challenge the decision. Instead, he just understood. That unsettled her more than it should have. For so long she had believed in absolute rule, in power that could not be questioned. But Quinn had shown her something else. Strength was not just in the ability to conquer, it was in the ability to choose a different path. She turned fully to face him. What will you do now? Quinn exhaled, glancing out at the city. Figured I'd wait and see if I still had a place here. Vira studied him, sensing the weight behind the words. He had come to this world as a soldier, as part of a diplomatic effort that had nearly been shattered by the attack. Yet, when the battle had begun, he had chosen to fight for her, for the Dominion. She considered that carefully before replying. You saved my life more than once today. His smirk returned. Yeah, well, you returned the favor. Vira stepped closer. Then stay. The words surprised even her. But she did not regret them. Quinn raised a brow. That an order, Your Highness? Request. His expression shifted, the teasing edge fading into something more genuine. All right, I'll stay. Vira nodded, satisfied. She turned back to the city, the weight of the future pressing down on her shoulders. The Dominion would change, it had to, and for the first time, she would not be facing that change alone. Quinn stood beside her, silent but present, and in that moment Vyra knew the battle was truly over. But their story was just beginning.